we'll be starting with our panel discussions now. The first panel is the authors panel, the topic being navigating the crux of publishing, and we have Professor Vidisha Chaudhary as the moderator. Over to you, ma'am.
Good afternoon, everyone. Is it already afternoon? Yes, almost. So, as we wait for the audience to come back after the long morning session, I'm just going to introduce the panelists today. And as maybe I introduce, all of you can come on the stage already. Okay, I'll start with Professor Srinath Srinivasa. He is the Dean R&D and also works in the domain of data science. He is the director of the Web Science Lab, and his research interest includes looking at the impact of the web, especially in the education and social empowerment. So the books that he is going to talk about, he has written 2 books. The books that he is going to talk about is the Theory of Being, System Sciences from a Traditional Indian Perspective, which was published in 2019. And another book that he wrote long time back, I just noticed, The Power of Law of Information, Life in a Connected World, which was published in 2006. Our next panelist is Professor Balaji. He works in the domain of IT and society. He is the co-founder of the Center for IT and Public Policy, in short CETA, at IIIT-Bangalore. Balaji's research interest, or he specializes in the domain of economic geography and economic sociology, and he works currently on social innovation and platform economy. The book that he is going to talk about today is called The Rise of the Hybrid Domain, Collaborative Governance for Social Innovation, which was published in 2016. Our next panelist is Professor Janaki Srinivasan. She works also in the domain of IT and society, and she is the current convener of Center for IT and Public Policy. Her research interest, she examines the political economy of technology and development, and her current research interests include data privacy, politics of algorithm, and digital financial inclusion. She also works on the platform economy. The book that she's going to talk about, which actually released last year, it's a very recent book. It has also a very catchy title, The Political Lives of Information and the Production of Development, which was published in 2022. And our last panelist is Professor Ashish Chaudhary. He works in theoretical computer science and specializes in cryptography. His book was also released last year. It's called Secure Multi-Party Computation Against Passive Adversaries, which was released in 2022. Welcome all of you, and thanks for that. So because we started a bit late, we also have less time in this panel, so we'll have to try and wrap up in 45 minutes. That's what the mandate that I was given. So I'll straight away get into today's theme. So one of the things that I wanted to start with, one is, of course, before getting into the logistic of how did you go about conceptualizing the book, the publishing and all that process, because all of you come from very different research domains as well, right? So the kind of books also you have published, like Ashish, your book is more of a textbook. Janaki, your book is a monograph of your, based on your research for many years and so on. So if you start with this process, then why do you even think of publishing a book? What role does book play as a output of your research in the specific disciplines that you identify yourself with? So if you can just start with that, we'll start with you.
So the main motivation for me to write the research monogram was to spread the excitement about the topic, secure multi-party computation, which also happened to be my PhD topic. So I started my PhD in 2006, and at that time I was looking for a textbook where I can find all the preliminary stuff, but unfortunately it was an advanced topic, so I couldn't find any textbook, and I really struggled because I had to read advanced research papers, and they were written by the stalwarts who already assumed some background, but I didn't have that background. And unfortunately, even the state of the art for the topic remains the same. You hardly have any textbook addressed to a beginner who can go and read and start going into the research area. So when I started teaching this course at IIIT, even my student asked, "Sir, can you specify a textbook where we can get the basics, the fundamentals?" Unfortunately, I said, we don't have anything. So that's when I realized that being a professor, it's also my academic dharma to pass on whatever I have learned about the topic for the next generation of researchers. And fortunately, I got an invitation from a publisher that why don't you write a research monogram about the topic. And that's the way I started this. I thought maybe I should write a textbook, a research monogram where everything should be written in such a way that it is easily readable for a non-specialist who want to explore the area. So that was basically the motivation for me.
So I got my PhD and did my dissertation in a department that was interdisciplinary. So for me, it was not actually such an obvious choice that what I'll do would be a book. But over time, as I started doing my research, it felt like intuitively felt like the best form. And maybe when we talk more about what we wrote about, it'll make more sense. But because the kind of research I do involves long-term ethnographic observation, etc., they don't really lend themselves as well to papers. And putting it together as a book seemed more coherent, seemed to make more sense. Of course, like Vidisha pointed out, different disciplines do value different types of output. So a book, in general, in the social sciences, is considered a very valuable output. So I'm sure that was somewhere there in the back of my mind, but my specific research project also drove me to do this. A third reason, and I think this has more to do with where you end up publishing, I was very keen that the work I do, which is at the intersection of technology and society, as it were, was something that I did want people who are not social scientists to also read. So that sort of influenced what venue I picked, and maybe we can talk about that later. But those were a few of my reasons.
So, some of the reasons that Janaki gave apply to me too. In my case, I also come from a very interdisciplinary background, and I also realized after having spent more than a decade publishing, first of all, when you're doing interdisciplinary work, it's not very easy at least to find outlets that will publish your work, because you're then more often than not speaking to certain disciplinary priorities and biases and saying that, this transcends boundaries, etc., doesn't easily go across or sell with either editors or reviewers primarily. It can be quite a challenge, right? Now, that's one side, one reason why when I decided to sort of say, I needed to get a book out. The second is that this book was based on research that I'd been doing over, maybe 6-7 years. And the idea is that, see, when you sort of have this sort of accumulated, research over a period of time, I think it's also useful to think about it, reflect on it, and then do a sort of a elaboration of ideas, which I think journal articles will never ever permit you, because there are word limitations, page limitations, and other constraints, right? So the research, of course, that I did, assuming I could have published it in journals, might have gotten me about a half a dozen or more journals, which keeps sort of the, shall we say, the bean counters happy. But then the idea is, but if you wanted to sort of synthesize ideas, develop them over, across a single sort of a publication, I think the book made the most sense. And I'm actually glad I wrote that. Okay, it was an awful lot of work. It was an awful lot of work because, it was 200 plus pages or close to 250 pages. And making sure it all hangs together is quite a journey. Very sort of fulfilling one, but nevertheless a lot of hard work. And it's about elaborating ideas, putting them together, and so that you're then not constrained by saying, am I going to please this discipline or that discipline? And I can actually freely sort of explore ideas that traverse disciplines and actually speaks to this whole notion of interdisciplinarity, which we all love to talk about, but often find it hard to, quote unquote, shall we say, implement or do on the ground. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is the toughest part. So, I have written 2 books, in 2 monographs actually. One was pretty old, back in 2006. The other is more recent in 2019. In both cases, by design, I did not try to write a textbook. In fact, my motivation was to basically make a point to a larger audience. Larger audience beyond academia, beyond my field of study and so on. My first book, for example, The Power Law of Information, basically I'm trying to argue that the internet and the World Wide Web is actually a game changer. So it was written in 2006, before we had Facebooks, before we had smartphones, before we had current day AI and so on. But for example, I had kind of predicted some things like social media, the emergence of fake news and the debates around it. I'd also argued about how the notion of money is going to change. Of course, I could not predict the emergence of cryptocurrency, but then I'd argued that the way that the internet is connecting us together, the idea of money is going to be fundamentally altered. And so these are some of the points which I wanted to make, in a sense, which could not really fit in a journal article or or even a textbook. These are basically very fundamental points. And the second book as well, A Theory of Being, what I'm arguing again will not fit into a mainstream technology textbook or a journal. Here I'm basically trying to argue that our entire approach towards building systems is incomplete in some sense, what I call machine hermeneutics. And because currently we are facing issues like AI ethics and so on. We are struggling to understand. The keynote address basically touched upon a lot of these points, that how is AI affecting our life and what is it that we are missing. And what I'm trying to argue is that we need to actually change the way we look at the world. So there is a quote by Werner Heisenberg that what we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of inquiry and so on. So the way we are inquiring about systems has a particular connotation, and that is something which we need to change. And I found it very hard to get for these fundamental ideas to gain acceptance in mainstream journals or even textbooks and so on. But it is inspiring our current research, where specific outputs we are able to publish from this. But the way of thinking is what I'm trying to document in my books.
So I think one thing that we get from all of your input is that there are different motivations, right? One, like as Ashish said, that he wanted to have a more accessible research output, where Janki's is like, I have done all this work and how do I make this sort of a coherent, put this into a coherent theme. So like when you decided that this is what you wanted to do, what's the first thing that you have to do? Like now I'm getting into more of a logistic step. Like, do you first decide the publisher, or first you try and put your ideas into one, space? And I'm sure that if it's a book, it does not come in one day, right? Like as Balaji very rightly pointed out, the journal has this problem of, it limits us in a way that in one article you can have only one argument, right? Or one idea. Whereas a book allows you to explore more ideas and bring them sort of together. So what is the first step? I'm sure there is no one formula. All of you have done it in a different way. So it would be good to also know about that.
Luckily for me, the publisher was decided first, because I got the invitation from the publisher only. For me, the major bottleneck was what to write, the structuring part, because the topic is enormously huge. And my goal was to write it in a way so that it is easily accessible. And my area is highly mathematical. So generally people find it very difficult to understand mathematical stuff because it is very dry, very abstract. So I was in a dilemma what to write, what not to write. But fortunately what happened for me that I also offered a course on NPTEL on the specific topic itself. And I spent an enormous amount of effort for structuring that NPTEL course itself. That what should be the topics and what should be the contents. So I decided that, okay, I should write a monogram as if I am preparing a set of lecture notes for that specific course itself. So the structuring was taken care. And once the structuring is taken care, I think everything then falls down very easily. Because you then just have to worry about that what should be there in specific sections and so on.
So one of the things I love about this exercise is sort of the retrospective coherence that you bring to it all. I think it's been such a long time since I first thought about this. It took me about 10, 11 years to get this out. I don't actually... I finished my dissertation in about 2011 and I had 2 cases in that. So just to give you a little bit of background on what the book is about, and I think we've been hearing this also through the 2 days of RISE. So I started my research interested in this phenomenon called ICTs for development, so the use of digital technologies for development. And after a few years of doing research on that, I realized that there is an underlying belief that underpins a lot of these initiatives, which is a belief in information itself. And that's sort of what my book is really about. It's to try and understand this underlying belief and then try and unpack why is it that people feel it empowers universally, automatically, everybody, and then try and understand how does it actually work on the ground in different kinds of initiatives, right? So who benefits from it, who's able to leverage it, etc. So what I had done in my dissertation is I had looked at 2 such cases. And after that, just after my dissertation, I took on another project which looked at a third, slightly different case. So each of these cases was different in that one was run by a political movement, one was run by a non-profit, and the third case that I took on was actually just the introduction of mobile phones through a market mechanism. So the third case is what told me that maybe putting these 3 together in a book would be a great idea. So the next step after that, which was I think 2013-14, was to write to publishers, and I was lucky that I was able to identify a series which seemed to align with what I was interested in. It was literally called the Information Society series from the MIT Press. Thankfully for me, when I wrote and sent them a proposal, they said they were interested. And after that, basically they ask you to write more and they send it to reviewers, etc. So it takes on a more structured process. But I just got lucky in that I identified a series that worked for me, and when I wrote to them, they actually were interested in the idea. So that's sort of how I came to it.
Balaji, when you address this question of how did you went about this process, right? Like first you had the book written and then publisher and all. I think it would also be helpful for both you and Srinath to touch upon this fact that what kind of publisher, like, so do you make a choice? Like, because I just thought about it because Janki said she went to MIT Press, which is an university press, right? Because in the previous round, we talked about how we want our ideas to be accessible when we write the book. So do you also factor that in choosing a publisher, that which publisher will make my book accessible? And for many of us, I mean, all of you went to a publisher which is outside India, right? So, and because of that, sometimes these books become very inaccessible to the Indian public. So did you factor that in, and how did you go about that? If you can also add that, that would be great.
Okay, this is in addition to what Janaki and Ashish mentioned. Yeah, so sure. So let me also, I think at this point, be useful very quickly to say, what the book that I wrote about was, and then, that will sort of feed into what I did. So the book that I wrote was looking at a period, the research actually goes back to about 2007, 2008, when we started to see a significant amount of innovation, grassroots kind of innovation in India, using technology. And India was moving away, although we significantly remain a software services country, it was at least starting to move away from that and trying to address local markets, local needs, at least in some sort of problem. So that sort of triggered my curiosity, because my own doctoral work back in the 90s really spoke to the software services industry. But then a lot of the rhetoric at that time was either rooted in the business school campus saying, oh, we're going to serve the bottom of the pyramid, or there were all these sort of technologists promising the magic wand to cure and sort of wish away poverty with new technologies that were emerging, right? So you really needed to find some kind of a middle ground. And what the book that, I co-authored that with a longtime friend of mine from graduate school days, we started looking at the institutional sort of the attributes that kind of innovation really needed if you wanted to address the needs of the poor and the underserved, right? The technology was essentially necessary but not sufficient, and business models themselves weren't going to quite cut it. So that's what we were really looking at, and we therefore realized we needed to talk to as broad an audience as possible. Now, in terms of these specific steps we actually took, and in terms of and to address the question that Vidisha just raised, I think we really didn't have a publisher in mind, right? We didn't know how we were going to go about it because it was the first book for both of us, me and my co-author. So what we did, luckily for us, this book was based on we got a grant from the National Science Foundation. So that was a pretty elaborate grant proposal that we had to write. So that was the sort of the bedrock of one of our first chapters, right? Subsequently, I think, we had a lot of empirical material that we gathered. But I think the other thing that really helped in my case was my friend Yuko and I, we were very lucky to get this book writing sort of we got invited to a book writing retreat in Bellagio in Italy at the Rockefeller Foundation, which actually gave us time to sort of reflect and talk to a bunch of fellow academics who were also there writing books, which was a wonderfully, we're very fortunate to have that experience. It's only after that we actually started to think in terms of, what precise structure should the book take. We got feedback from a lot of people who had been there, done that. And we then had two choices. It was clear this was going to be, on the one hand, it was rooted in a sort of, what shall I say, in the research domain, but at the same time, we wanted to make sure we wrote it so that it would be very broadly accessible, because we're challenging some of the assumptions the technologists are making. We are also challenging the assumptions of the B-school variety. So we needed to sort of span a range, and if Ashish made the point about math being sort of, hard to digest, it's an equal challenge to sort of have a vocabulary that speaks to a wide range of disciplines, right? So we needed to sort of figure out how exactly to do that. So we couldn't predetermine the publisher. If we went to, for us it really came down to either going to a university press like MIT Press, or going to a commercial publisher who specialized in academic work, right? And we chose the latter. We went to Edward Elgar, right? And what they did, they have channels that reach out to a much broader sort of a segment, across. And we also consciously chose a global publisher simply because of the reach it would have, because these ideas were not relevant only in India. There were similar debates taking place in countries like Brazil and many parts of Africa about what is it that technology can do as a means of emancipating the underserved, right? So we wanted that kind of a reach. Now, we did make a trade-off, and I think this is a painful trade-off we had to make. Remember, all publishers, you make these kinds of trade-offs. These private publishers are insanely expensive. I wouldn't pay the kind of price that was expected, the cover price on my book. I'll tell you that much, right? So what we do then is we find ways and means of getting around that, not all of which I will say narrate in public, and to essentially to get the book out to those who are interested. But I do think that these are, the thing with, say, a university publisher is that they tend to address a much more limited audience in terms of a scholarly community. We were very clearly interested in also talking to the policy community and also people who were, the research involved, grassroots organizations like NGOs and so on. We wanted our language, the findings to actually reach them too, because it was relevant to them. So that's why we made that conscious choice, but you have to pay a price. Right? And it was really the price of the book. That really what it came down to. So to just sum up in one sentence, we didn't really, I don't think I will offer a coherent story of publication. So we were lucky to write a proposal that got funded, lucky to get invited to a place where we could reflect with other authors who gave us a lot in terms of their own experience. And then after that, it was a lot of hard work. You make mistakes, you write a proposal. We wrote to 2 or 3 publishers, not just one. You write proposals to each of these publishers, they give you feedback. So it's an iterative process, and finally we settled on Edward Elgar. Right? So it's rare. I wish, I had an invitation like Ashish did and saying, hey, come on and write a book for us. Life would have been a lot simpler. But anyway, that's my story. Over to Ashish.
So even in my case, there were no invitations as such. We did get some. In fact, even now a publisher is talking to us, but most of the publishers are interested in writing textbooks, books that sell. Obviously they want they want us to align our books to preferably to a specific university or school and so on. But that was not the motivation. Like I said, the motivation for my books was more philosophical. That is to push a philosophical point to a larger audience that we need a change in the way we approach things. And so I'll just give some ways of how we went about. about. So in my case, I was pretty much the lone wolf. I did not work in a team, and not just the lone wolf, but also talking something very different. So it took a lot of while for me to convince publishers. In fact, I failed the second time actually. So the first time, finally, after talking to a few publishers, one of them agreed to talk about the impact of the web and so on. And again, everyone was kind of confused about the topic of my. So the topic is called power law of information. And like you also mentioned, it's almost confused as power of law of information or power of law, all kinds of. Because what they couldn't get was I was trying to make a pun on a statistical distribution called power law distribution. And typically, we are taught that the Gaussian or the normal distribution. We kind of behind that. Why do we call the Gaussian distribution the normal distribution? Behind that lies a lot of assumptions about how the world works, and that is what I'm trying to address. That no, that's not how the world works. In fact, for a lot of things in the online world, you have a very different kind of distribution. Now, power law typically, very intuitively means, very skewed distribution, the 80-20 rule and so on, right? And so that was the pun. And to get across that pun took a very long time. In fact, I remember in the first version of my book, I'd even written the equation of the power law distribution. And the publisher came back and saying, this won't sell, this won't go. You need to remove all equations and you need to really explain it and so on. And you need to reduce charts and, in mathematical looking diagrams and write better diagrams and so on. So that was my first kind of experience. In the second experience as well, in fact, like I said, I failed with that in the sense here what I'm trying to address again is how we understand systems. So we kind of, today I keep telling my students that whenever I ask them to define a system, they define a machine. In fact, they say it's a set of components interacting with each other to achieve a common purpose and so on. And that's the definition of a machine. But over the last few years, we have kind of confused or conflated systems with machines, and which is where we are suffering today because we don't know, we can't tell a machine or like we talk to human beings. If a human is going rogue, we can appeal to their conscience. And so on. But if a robot is going rogue, you can't appeal to its conscience. There's something really fundamentally different, and we are trying to ask, all kinds of questions. Where does consciousness come in, and so on? So the philosophical argument I was trying to make is that our entire approach to understanding systems should change, and really it didn't go well at all. In fact, I could not convince the publisher to actually publish. So finally, I ended up independently publishing it on Amazon myself, because we could not. And so that has been my journey. So,
Thank you so much. So the other question was, another thing that I noticed that some of you wrote, did this, completed this journey on your own. As you said, I was a lone wolf. And some of you had a co-conspirator, right? So how is it different? So if, to have somebody, sometimes it's very good to collaborate and write something along, but it also leads to difference of opinion that delays the process. So I'm just curious to know how did that pan out for all of you?
Okay, so yeah, there were difference of opinions in terms of writing style or what should be there, what should not be there. But yeah, somehow you have to come to the convergence that, okay, this is what you have to go. But fortunately, in my case, there was not too much of difference of opinion because the bulk of the book was written by me initially, and then there was a follow-up by my co-author who actually did second pass of the book and then added her explanation and all that. So for me, it was not a big deal actually to come up with a common draft. There was not too much of difference of opinion because fortunately for me, she also happened to be my research collaborator over the last 16 years.
And also wife.
Okay, so if you are making it public, yeah. Yeah. So at the end of the day, you have to listen to your master. So, yeah.
Very brave of you. Janaki?
I thought maybe I could bring up the edited volume a little bit. So we were supposed to be joined today by another colleague, Sridhar, and actually that was a great collaborative exercise. So we brought out an edited volume called Data Centered Living, and many of us in the institute contributed chapters to that. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because that's when I realized how much easier it is if there's someone sitting on your head giving you deadlines, which was our editor in that case. I mean, of course, I'm sure it was extremely difficult for him to pull us all together. That's a separate question. But as a chapter author, I think it made life much easier. But I think what was also interesting in that is because we all came from different disciplinary perspectives. We were looking at different domains. Like I was writing about cashlessness, for example. Someone else was writing about games. Somebody else was writing about governance. And in fact, Amit is here in the audience. He did one of the chapters. So in a sense, that book was interesting because each of us were writing on a slightly different thing and with a different disciplinary lens. So we weren't necessarily directly talking to each other about each chapter, but Sridhar was doing a lot of that labor. So I'm sure it was very difficult for him, but for me, one of the side benefits was someone was telling me when to turn in things, which was very different when it came to my book. And if I'm very serious about this, it took a pandemic for me to get my book out, honestly. So it took that kind of sitting in one place and saying, the world is changing in so many ways. Surely I can do this one small thing. So that was the final push I needed. But yeah, quite difficult, very grateful for all the people who gave reviews. But when it finally comes back to you, it's hard to finally say, I'm done. And I kept remembering this thing that an advisor of mine had told me about my dissertation, which was that a dissertation is just a shitty first draft of your book. Of course, with your book, you no longer have that excuse, but I sort of told myself that it's okay. These are conversations we are having. So it's important to put out what I'm thinking about now, and it's the conversation that will improve it rather than bringing out some absolutely finished end product. So telling yourself that helps, but it was hard overall.
So in the process of writing or co-authoring the book, there were a set of practical issues that came up and some conceptual issues that came up. The practical issue was this. My co-author was in the middle of her sabbatical year, writing the book. A word or a phrase that we don't know for the most part in this country, certainly not at this institute, right? A. B, I was also the first dean of faculty at the institute and trying to write rules, regulations, procedures, and processes alongside trying to figure out late in the evening what should go into which empirical chapter or which journal article I should be reading to sort of substantiate a nuanced point of theory. Okay? And this kind of annoyed my co-author because she was making progress far more rapidly, and here I was almost sort of holding the process back. So luckily we're friends, we go back 30 years, so we'd quarrel and then make up, so that's fine. So pretty late at night because she's on the east coast of the US. So those are the practical challenges. But so what we did to sort of, we anticipated some of these things. So what we did was we broke up the chapters. Once we had a rough chapter structure, each one of us took responsibility for certain chapters. And having led the fieldwork in this country, because the empirical material I led, given that she had better access to literature, libraries, and so on, she led a lot of the review material and so on. But of course, once you write these things separately, then comes the challenge of knitting them together, right? You do need to do that. Here, I think I'd make one important point. It's not, I'd be very honest, it's not just that the two of us were authors of the book. I would give credit to at least a half a dozen other people, okay, who are only mentioned in the acknowledgements, who read complete drafts of the book and were able to point to gaps, holes, and conceptual issues that needed to be bridged. I would give them some portion or some fraction of the authorship, if fractional authorship was at all possible, like in an edited book. And I think these half a dozen people, many of whom are really close friends, who took the trouble, pointed out, look guys, it's very clear this is written by Balaji and that's written by Yuko, and or not only that in terms of language styles, but also because these things just don't seem to be adding up, right? You need to fix this. So I think in that sense, it was a collective effort. And like they say, most things that we think we do on our own, we don't. And this was a classic instance. This was a lesson that I learned through that process. And finally, even though the sort of the book reached, and I have a different version of what Janaki just said. One of my supervisors on my dissertation committee members, who actually wrote 18 books, how he did it, don't ask me. Okay, he told me, if you're not unhappy with your book, the moment, or the manuscript, the moment it leaves your table, you're not thinking. So there's a lot that you can actually do to reflect, and the ways you can say, I would have rewritten this book, but nevertheless, the credit for that book is not just with me and my co-author, but to a whole bunch of other people who contributed by reading versions. When we were in this writing retreat in Italy, where were some like a dozen other people who were constantly commenting, and let me be also honest, very candid here, right? I think we learn a lot as academics when we go into the classroom and teach, because quite often, right, you get questions that you do not anticipate, that sort of get you to think in various ways, and I think have either tacitly, if not explicitly, influenced what research output I've generated, including in that book. So I think it is like the authorship, there is a formal authorship, and that rests on a whole sort of it's in a sort of a substratum of multiple fellow authors and people who can legitimately claim fractional authorship. Yeah.
Thanks, Balaji. So in my case, again, both my books were monographs, and I wish I really solved the problem of co-authorship of books. It's something which I could never, solve this problem. In both my cases, I'm also working on a third book, and again, it's the same case. In all of these cases, I'm basically a contrarian, trying to say what we are doing wrong. With the current state of the art, and at a very fundamental level, and so it's very hard to kind of get someone to agree at that level. And I've had interactions with very, very talented people, very for both my books, even the Power Law of Information. I remember we had really long discussions with many of them. But they're just featured in the acknowledgements currently. They could not. We could not really agree to a level where this is the story that we are going to say. And same thing with my Theory of Being book. I've had some really distinguished people with whom I've interacted with, and they were excited about this, but really we couldn't agree upon the nitty-gritties. How exactly are we going to propose this, and they're just featured in this one. So I really wish I could get co-authors in the future at least, and working alone is and that too being a contrarian is a very lonely activity, in the sense you're second guessing yourself all the time at every step. So you're not really sure, are you making the right point, and is it going to. So there's no one with you fully, even especially when some of your supposed co-authors, which I hoped would be co-authors, would drop out. Then you start. That's a big morale dampener, actually, saying that okay, maybe I'm thinking wrong, and so on. And so it goes through all those travails, and of course, finally, when the publisher is not interested, you can see that they are looking at sales and so on. They're not really looking at the content, the argument, and so on. But still, it's a kind of a morale dampener on here, saying that is there something wrong with the point I'm trying to make, and so on. And so I think there's no real there's no simple way out of this, and but of course the other point of it, once the book was published, I've got some really good feedback from there. For the Power Law of Information book, I was even invited by the University of Utrecht in Netherlands to give a talk on that. And the University of Groningen and so on, and so try and understand. So in retrospect, they could see the point, but while going through it, making that point was quite tough to make. So.
Thanks for that. So I have like two last questions that I'll club together, and maybe all of you can answer, and then we can open the floor for the audience to ask more questions. So one is that what would be your advice to somebody who is aspiring or thinking even writing a book? And the second, along with it, is this, when you have the book, one thing Balaji mentioned that, you should never be completely happy, right, about whether it's your thesis or a book. But how has the, others reacted to you or your book after the book was released, did that sort of meet your expectation? Or sometimes, and it does not have to be in a bad way or a good way, right? It's always a mixed bag. And book writing is also a creative process as much as an academic sort of a journey. So in that creative process, what we tend to produce and what others interpret it as sometimes are very different. So if you have any anecdotal stories which are interesting here, that you never thought that your book could be interpreted in such a way, that would be a nice way to sort of end this.
So I would like to answer your second question. So once the book was formally published, then we announced it in our community. So we have a very nice community, a discussion forum where we can announce anything, means like conference notifications or postdoc. It's called a distributed computing community, where we have almost everyone working in that. You have all the email addresses there subscribed. So we announced the book there. And immediately we could see a lot of positive feedback being received from our fellow researchers. In fact, a couple of them, in fact, read the whole book within 1 week. And they gave elaborate feedback that this is the way you should have done the structuring of the book. And even now we are keep on getting regular feedback about the book, like the various typos or how we could have made the book better by, say, adding exercise problems or better explanations. So yeah, till now the feedback has been very good about the book. Regarding the motivation, I feel that whoever is offering any elective course, once they reach a stage where they are sufficiently experienced, it's definitely their duty, moral, academic duty, to write some form of research monogram to address the wider community and tell what they have learned about the topic. It could be philosophical, non-philosophical, whatever.
Advice to people, I'm not sure. I guess the only thing I would say is
You can advise them not to write a book at all. That
that would be a step too far, I think. I mean, it does feel very fulfilling when it's finally out, but I think it's going to be very important that it's a topic that you're invested in for the long haul, right? I think that would, for me, be the most important part of it. I mean, and in retrospect, you wish you had done some things differently. I definitely think I could have gotten this out slightly earlier. And I think part of that is to really push yourself and remember that nobody else is going to push you. I think I had some notion in my head that my publisher was really interested in getting the book out. As it turns out, it's basically your baby, right? So you have to keep pushing. So I thought that was very important. I did do a series of talks in very, very different departments in October. And I was astounded by how different the questions were, also because I have 3 fairly different cases. So if I went to a library school, it would become a question about, well, does the community have a library and how does information flow through libraries? And my book didn't really get to that at all, but that was a question that came out of the book and made me sort of think about it differently, right? Much like Balaji was saying, classrooms push you to, students' questions push you to think differently about your own work. So very grateful for that. And it's also amazing because you have been in it for so long by the time the book gets out, that you sometimes can lose perspective, right? And people bringing it back to saying, here's how this is relevant in my life is actually very, very rewarding. Interestingly, one of my most enjoyable engagements about the book was around its cover. So my press gave me a very generic sort of low-income country using computer kind of picture on top, which I really did not want the book to carry. So I worked with someone to design the cover, and it turns out this was this like really dedicated woman who started reading the book. I had not expected her to do that. So just to see this PDF with all these yellow highlights that she was trying to convert into an illustration was in its own very weird way also very rewarding. And it led to a book cover that then people started asking me other questions and interpretations about. So I had not thought that would be an entry point into a conversation, and it was. So yeah, I think those were my stories.
Okay, if you ask me, and you have especially if you're an academic, whether you're writing a textbook or a book for a general audience or a research monograph, I'll say just do it. Okay, why is it? Because various people are in sort of various, some in lines of business. Somebody's in the software business, somebody's in, I don't know, garments business. We are in the business of ideas. That's what academics really are about, right? And scholars, right? So, and what a book really allows you to do is to synthesize ideas, and you can do it in original ways, provocative ways, whether you're writing a textbook, whether you're writing something, a relatively jargon-free volume for the general public, or even if you're writing a book for a more narrow sort of academic audience. I think that ability to synthesize, you really mature, right? And to me, that made a huge difference. Never mind whether the book was good or bad, that's a separate story. You just learn this sort of art of synthesis, you learn how ideas connect to one another, right? And you start to connect them in ways that you didn't think was even possible. So from that point of view, I would highly recommend everybody to at least take a shot at it, whatever the nature of the book. Right? And coming to the part two of Bidisha's question, by the way, it's a painful exercise, but then, no pain, no gain, as they say. The second part is that, of course, the book went out, there are all these standard journal article reviews, your friends say good things about it, those who don't like you much don't say very nice things about you, all those sorts of things. We're a pretty tribal community. But the thing is that I think what it did, because the book was very interdisciplinary, it sort of came out with a couple of new ideas. We may not have changed the world, but we did have a couple of new ideas. I think that ability to sort of transcend certain boundaries caught the attention of certain people, right? And what it did was I started being invited to newer communities that I was not part of, right? And I started doing things, projects, contributing, getting invitations to publish here, there. The invitations in my case came later, Ashish, unlike you. Or even, being part of projects in things, in areas that I never thought. I mean, the current work that I'm doing on digital platforms could sort of trace its lineage, in a manner of speaking, to the work that I did in the book, right? Which was completed 6-7 years ago. So what I'm saying is it opens up doors, intellectual doors for yourself, right? And I think for that reason, I would advocate people to do books. And even if your book sort of, doesn't sort of fly either commercially or whatever it is, it's just that you learn new ways of synthesizing ideas, new ways of looking at the world. And for that reason, I think it's worth it. But I'm also sure if you spend enough, like Janaki rightly said, if you're passionate about something, you'll do a pretty decent job with it. And you're certainly going to get noticed for it. So please do it.
So from my side, for the first part of the question on the advice, a kind of a tongue-in-cheek advice, please don't use ChatGPT to write books. And of course, I mean, but to say I've had really good fun with ChatGPT, interactively generating stories and so on. It generates magnificent stories. The thought even crossed my mind, maybe I should publish some of these as books and so on. But really, the act of writing a book, as Balaji was saying, right, is really about what you want to say. And write a book because you want to say something to the world. And there's a nice quote by Leslie Lamport from an ACM Turing Award winner and so on. It says, writing shows how sloppy your thinking is. And so on. Right? So basically when you start writing, you actually clarify your own thoughts. And it's the real payoff or the real outcome from a book is how it changes your own perspective. And how much clarity you yourself get as you write, more than the impact that it creates in the outside world and so on. Of course, regarding now the second part of the question, yes, there have been some impact. For example, my first book, I was invited by the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands to give a talk and so on. But beyond that, really, for me, what felt very gratifying was once when we had the HAL airport here, right? And so I was sitting in the lounge, and there was a bookstore over there. My book was there in that bookstore, and there was some stranger, I don't even know who that was now, was browsing through lots of books and decided to buy this book. and so on. And so browsing through a lot of this, and I think that was that moment of gratification, that somebody is finding this interesting and so on. And also for my second book as well, it's I've been got some kind of response from and reviews and others. But really, my biggest gratification is how it has inspired some set of students who are working with me now, right? And they've really got the point. They've got the point that I'm trying to make, and they're coming out with new ideas. Why do we, what does it take to inculcate a sense of self into AI, and how does it affect responsible AI? All kinds of, and it's completely gratifying just sitting in these research meetings, listening to these new ideas and so on. So it's the potential of what it generates in the past, and that's what it really gratifies, rather than what I get back at this point.
Thank you. So we'll now open the floor for questions. So you can direct it to a specific panelist. Yes.
Yeah, so from the discussion, probably it is very clear that book writing is a massive exercise for an individual, but I wanted to understand this. So would you suggest that it is a good practice to release the content of a book in micro and small packets in the form of some article in popular media or blogs? So is it advisable, or we should bring everything together and then take the review from a few people? What is a better way, or what is a better approach?
You ask me, it's always better to have a draft of everything and then release it with your fellow researchers to get a feedback. Again, it varies from community to community, but at least with respect to my community, which is cryptography and distributed computing, I will strongly recommend to have a draft of the entire thing and then only get the feedback from your fellow researchers.
I think the question so much more on feedback. She's asking if you can release it chapter-wise, like you did the video links, for example.
Oh, okay. So are you okay? But I guess most of the publisher ask for the entire draft of the book.
You are asking after publication? Before?
No, before publication.
But will the publisher allow that, to release your book chapter-wise? It again depends upon the publisher. Of course, few publishers ask for sample chapters. Maybe that constitutes 30% of the book, and then they get it reviewed from their set of experts and so on. But as far as computer science publishers are concerned, they mostly ask for the entire book content rather than publishing it or releasing it chapter-wise.
So I think I have done a little bit of both, though as Ashish pointed out, it's never the exact thing that you're going to put in the book. Like I said, my book had 3 different cases. So I have written about those cases from other perspectives. And I would say that feedback definitely helped me, or the comments that raised helped me knit a better story in the book. But I didn't put out exactly what's in the chapters. And honestly, that was not like I didn't even think of asking the publisher, or that's not how I was thinking of how to put out my work. But I think comments are generally useful. But typically a book will have an overarching argument, right? That was not something I necessarily had published before. But individual cases and other points that they raise, I had. And that was helpful.
Yeah, in my case, see, the thing is, yes, the book had an overarching argument, and it had to sort of get some buy-in. And I think feedback is very crucial in this process of writing, right? Because ultimately, even if others are sort of reading your drafts and so on, the buck stops with you, right? So you need to even if you share the idea, the concrete form it takes in terms of how it is written, what kind of literature you actually refer to, what kind of cases you actually use to substantiate what you're doing. All that is mostly your decisions you still have to make, even if there's a certain credibility to the argument that you're making. And in the case, the book that I co-authored, I mean, it goes back to the days when we were actually writing a proposal. We got a proposal from the National Science Foundation in the US. It went through 3 rounds of rejection, and we got funded on the 4th round. And each rejection came with 7 reviewers giving their feedback. So it was a sort of, in that sense, that's why I said this is not a lone journey, right? It went through this evolutionary process. And at every stage you get feedback, and I think that's, in my opinion, quite critical. Although the book itself, if you break down the book into parts, some parts, not necessarily chapters, conceptual parts, right? All of them had some kind of verification or some kind of feedback. Not verification necessarily, feedback from people. But the book is great, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So ultimately you're still responsible. So yes, it's a good idea to get feedback along the way, but be ready to take responsibility for the final product. The buck stops with you.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think all of them have really answered the question. In my case as well, I did have my own blog post where I'd noted down some of these ideas. And just to kind of refine the argument, there are quite a few different blog posts, and the arguments were all piecemeal. And if you were to read just one blog post in isolation, it would not really, it would be hard to see the synergy that I'm trying to get in my mind in just one post. And so that's when really writing it all together and giving it a storyline really matters. And but initially, these kinds of, to help hone my own arguments, I'd written some of these blog posts.
Any other question?
Thank you everyone for a very enlightening session. So my question is about having a co-author, and we have talked a lot about, conceptually being on the same in the same page, or content-wise being on the same page. How do you establish that unified voice? How do you establish that unified voice linguistically? Because conceptually, many of us are definitely on the same page when we decide to embark on this project together, but often the way I choose to express it might be different from my co-authors. So, any tips?
I think Balaji and Ashish. Balaji, go ahead.
You decided on the kitchen table, did you? Okay, all I say is this: when you say, how do you sort of linguistically how do you sort of, there's linguistic unification of, a conceptual unity, right? That's what you're asking. Look, you can do this at two levels. One, there's the semantic, and the other is the syntactic, right? Semantic, then you start to actually, that's an iterative process, in the sense that you decide, shall we refer to this literature? Shall we, what kind of meaning does this concept really have to take? Because a concept can take multiple, when you're sort of debating these things, they can take on nuances. So then you say, I read, you read, let's see what happens. And, you go through this process. There is no one, clear, well-defined road. You will have debates, you will have arguments, you will have differences of opinion. There are things in the book that I would never agree with. Likewise, my co-author would never agree with other things that I put in the book and sort of forced it. So these things will be there. There's a certain amount of compromise, right? The syntax, I think, is the easier bit. You have very good, proofreaders, etc., who will help you these days get through these things. Yeah, I'm not a native speaker of English. My co-author is not a native speaker of English. So yes, we have our own idiosyncratic ways of expressing semantically confused ideas, right? So everything sort of had to sort of be ironed out. And we did this through a process of debate initially, and subsequently we did benefit from a good proofreading. Yeah, thanks.
Maybe I can add a few things. So there was a kind of a hilarious meme some time ago on social media about saying that if you want to really try out if somebody is compatible for you, try to co-author with them. So that's co-authorship is really a major exercise. Many times I've seen, even when so there are basically two elements to writing. One is the idea, the other is the expression or the way it is written. And so many times, even when there is a coherence in ideas, people fall apart due to coherence in expression, and they want to express the same ideas in a completely different way, the argument and so on. And really, we are all people. We all have our own signature, expression signature. I think really it's a question of finding the right co-author or compromising. Finding the right compromise as well.
Any other question we have?
May I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead.
It's too concentrated on these 3 seats, so I hope it's okay. So I hope it will not be taken as boastfulness if I share with you that the first book that I wanted to write or started writing was when I was in 7th standard. Okay, and I have gone through that exercise several times. I have never finished a book, and that's the reason why I'm sitting here in the audience and not in the dais. What I have experienced repeatedly is that there are two demons that I have always found myself fighting when I was trying to write a book, and I have never conquered them. One was, of course, the daily rigors of life, very, very unglamorous aspects of your life where you have to deal with your professional duties, your domestic duties, etc., etc. And they simply, the book writing process is such a long haul that at some point you just lose sight of your goal and you just get carried away with your daily rigors. That's one thing. The other thing is particularly of the kind of book that Srinath has written, where you do not have any prior affirmation from outside that you even deserve to write a book on that topic. So at some point your self-doubt catches up with you and you just decide that, oh, why am I even trying to be self-presumptuous and write on something I don't deserve to? So how do you deal with these two issues? So that was the question. I would like to be on the dais on some future day.
Srinath, you want to start with that?
Well, I'm not really, completely agree. There is no, with what Sujit said, but really, this is exactly what I've faced as well, in the sense I've often caught second guessing myself. Why am I trying to push this around? Because there's nobody around me who is understanding what I'm trying to say and so on. It has been very hard in terms of balancing, normal professional and personal life and writing a book and so on. But somewhere, I don't know, I also felt that if I don't write this, these ideas are going to die along with me, or in some sense. Somehow this is something that needs to be told. And it's not really about me, it's not about me being pretentious, but it's something about this idea which is kind of important, and we need, somebody needs to think about it, and why can't it be me, and so on. So that's the kind of rationale I've been telling myself. So
I can take a stab. So I think exactly right? I think I'm sure all of us went through that, and it's not, again, it's not very clear what we mean by whose affirmation we need, right? Because there are always so many communities, in a sense, that are involved in what you're writing. In my case, whether as the people I engaged with in the writing of the case studies or different audiences, etc. So for me, for instance, one of the kinds of self-doubt that always comes in, and I think this has a little bit to do with the fact that I speak both in technology communities as well as social scientists, it can often come back to, why are you shooting down this idea that you don't have the alternative solution for, right? So give me the fix instead of telling me the problem, right? And while you may not see it when I'm answering your question, sometimes that gets to you, right? Because you start wondering, well, for instance, the idea that I'm critiquing in the book is this idea that information empowers. There can be, I don't have a solution for that. The solution that I provide in the book is to think more deeply about what we call information and what power we impute to it. But that's not a solution in the sense of I can go out tomorrow and deploy it, right? But at the same time, I felt like it was an important idea to get out there because of the amount of faith that the world has invested in it, whether through funding or just how much time you put thinking into that. And you sort of take that as a given on which you build several other things. And to me, it felt like a very urgent need to say that framing the problem in those terms can be bad for the world, right? And finally, I think, like Shrikant said, that's what pushed me to write it more than anything else. Plenty of self-doubt, right? It shows in the amount of time that it takes you to get the book out. But at some point, you feel like this is an idea that needs to be out there. It isn't out there enough, or I have something to say in addition to the ways in which this idea is being put out. So finally, for me, that's what pushed me to cross that final line.
Thank you, everyone, but I think we are running out of time.
I failed Shiva's mandate of 45 minutes of wrapping this up. It took 1 hour as usual. So I just wanted to thank everyone and thank the audience for coming in and asking also nice questions. And thank you all of the panelists.